The door of the Hadley ranch house burst open so hard it cracked against the outer wall, and Helen Slater stumbled backward into the dusty yard with her heart hammering so violently she could hear it in her ears. Both of Cecil Hadley's sons stood in the doorway, shoulder to shoulder, for the first time in their adult lives, and the look on their faces was not one of brotherly reconciliation. It was fury. It was the kind of fury that had been coiled and waiting for years, and she had, without meaning to, handed it a direction. "You told him," Everett said. His voice was low and dangerous, the way a creek sounds just before it floods. "I did not tell him anything," Helen said, her voice steady even though her hands were trembling. "I told both of you, that is the difference." Thomas, the older one, stepped off the porch and onto the dry earth. He was 26 years old, broad-shouldered, and had his father's dark eyes. Right now those eyes were burning with something she could not name. "You had no right," he said. "Whatever happened between our father and our mother is not your business. You have been here 6 weeks. 6 weeks during which I watched your father nearly drink himself to death," Helen said, and she did not step back. She had not come all the way from St. Louis to step back. 6 weeks during which neither of you visited. 6 weeks during which the man who built this ranch with his own 2 hands sat alone in that house every single night with a bottle and a photograph. The photograph. She should not have mentioned the photograph. She could see it in the way both of them stiffened, the way the air between them suddenly changed from hot anger to something older and more broken. "Where is he?" Everett asked. He was 24, leaner than his brother, with lighter hair and a restless quality that reminded Helen of smoke. "He rode out this morning," Helen said. "He does not know you are here. And if the 2 of you had waited even 1 hour before turning your anger on me, I would have told you that myself." They stared at her. She stared back. The Kansas wind pushed a curtain of dust between them, and somewhere behind the barn a horse stamped its foot against dry ground. Then Thomas said something that Helen had not expected. He said, "He wrote us both letters and told us not to come." And Everett said, "He told me you were leaving." And Helen understood in that one terrible moment that Cecil Hadley had tried, in his dark and wounded way, to send away every person who might possibly save him. That was how it started. Not with romance, not with slow glances across a supper table, not with the gentle courtship that Helen had imagined when she first answered the advertisement in the St. Louis Dispatch in the late spring of 1882. It started with betrayal, with hidden grief, and with a man who had decided he deserved to suffer alone. Helen Rebecca Slater had grown up in a 2-room house near the river in St. Louis, the daughter of a schoolteacher father who died of cholera when she was 17, and a mother who remarried quickly and poorly. Her stepfather was not a cruel man, but he was a small one, and the house had grown crowded with his opinions and his children, and by the time Helen was 22 she had become very good at being invisible. She had also become very good at reading at figures, and at recognizing when a situation required action rather than patience. The advertisement had been placed by a lawyer in Dodge City, Kansas, acting on behalf of one Cecil Hadley, rancher, widower, age 41. It described a man of substantial property and honest character, who required a capable woman to manage his household and correspondence, with the possibility of marriage to follow if both parties found themselves agreeable. Helen had answered it because the word capable felt more real than any word she had ever applied to herself before, and because Kansas felt far enough from her stepfather's small opinions that she could breathe again. She had not expected Cecil Hadley to be beautiful. She had not expected that when she stepped off the stage in Dodge City on a burning afternoon in late June of 1882, the man waiting at the edge of the road would be tall and weathered and quiet in a way that felt like strength rather than silence, with gray threaded through his dark hair, and a jaw that looked like it had been carved with deliberate care. He was 41 and he looked like the West itself, like something that had been tested and had not broken, though it had come close. "Miss Slater," he said, and his voice was deep and careful, as if words were things he did not spend carelessly. "Mr. Hadley," she said, and she put out her hand, and when he shook it his grip was firm and his eyes, which were the dark brown of river water at dusk, stayed on her face for exactly 1 second longer than was strictly necessary. That was the first thing she noticed about Cecil Hadley. He looked at her as if she was a problem he found interesting. She noticed the second thing on the ride out to the ranch. He did not speak much, but when he did speak he was direct without being unkind, and he told her without any pretense that he was not good company, that the house was in considerable disorder, that his sons would likely not approve of her presence, and that she should feel no obligation to stay beyond a fortnight if she found the arrangement unsuitable. And what would make it suitable? Helen asked. He considered that. He considered it the way he seemed to consider everything, with a kind of slow, thorough attention that made her feel, oddly, respected. "If you could stand the quiet," he said finally, "and if you were not afraid of hard work." "I am not afraid of hard work," Helen said. "And I have been living in a house full of noise for 5 years. Quiet sounds like a luxury." He glanced at her sideways, and something moved in his expression that might, in a different man, have been the beginning of a smile. The ranch itself was in Comanche County, Kansas, a good stretch south and west of Dodge City, sitting on a flat piece of earth that went on so long in every direction it made the sky feel enormous. The house was large and had once been well cared for, with a covered porch and proper glass in the windows, but it had been allowed to decline in ways that spoke of a person who had stopped caring about his surroundings. There was dust on every surface, dishes in the kitchen that had not been properly washed, a bookshelf full of volumes that someone had once loved and then left. Helen walked through the house while Cecil stood in the doorway watching her, and she catalogued everything quietly, and when she was done she turned and said, "I will need flour, salt pork, lye soap, and a new scrub brush by tomorrow morning." Cecil Hadley stared at her for a moment and then said, "I will send the hand into town." His hand was a young man named Darnell Cooper, 18 years old, black, and possessed of a cheerful efficiency that Helen immediately appreciated. Darnell had been with the ranch for 2 years and knew every corner of it and was also, Helen quickly discovered, quietly and thoroughly protective of Cecil Hadley in the way that decent young men sometimes are of older men they have decided to respect. He was not always like this, Darnell told her one morning in the 3rd week, when Helen was standing on the porch watching Cecil ride out alone toward the southern pasture in the thin early light. Before Mrs. Hadley passed, he was different. He used to laugh. Helen turned and looked at Darnell. "When did she pass?" 3 years ago this September," Darnell said. "Fever, it went fast, Mr. Hadley. He was over in Meade County at the time buying cattle. Did not make it back in time." He paused. "I think that is the part that broke him." Helen did not say anything. She looked back at Cecil's retreating figure, small now against the enormous Kansas sky, and she felt something shift in her chest that she did not entirely have words for. She learned more about Margaret Hadley, Cecil's wife, from the things she found in the house rather than from anything Cecil said. A woman's Bible on the nightstand in the room Helen had been given, which had clearly once been the main bedroom, before Cecil moved to the smaller room at the end of the hall. A collection of pressed wildflowers in a wooden box in the parlor, each one labeled in a careful hand. A quilt on the settee that had been worked in blues and greens. Margaret Hadley had been a woman who paid attention to beautiful things, and the house still held her presence like a fragrance that had mostly faded but not entirely gone. Helen treated Margaret's things with respect. She did not move the Bible or the flowers. She washed the quilt carefully and laid it back where it belonged. These were the acts of a woman who understood that she was a guest in someone else's grief. Cecil noticed. She could tell he noticed by the way he looked at the quilt one evening when he came in for supper, a long quiet look that he did not know she saw, and then he sat down at the table and ate the supper she had made, and when it was done he said, "That was the best meal I have had in 3 years." Helen said, "It was only stewed beef and cornbread." Cecil said, "Yes." That was the third thing she noticed about him. He could pack a volume of meaning into a single syllable. The rhythm of the ranch established itself around her gradually. Cecil left early and came back at dusk. Darnell managed the horses and the fencing. Helen kept the house, handled the correspondence that Cecil had let pile up dangerously, planted a kitchen garden in the strip of ground behind the house, and slowly, carefully, began to draw the edges of a life around herself. She was not unhappy. She was, in fact, more content than she had been in years, which was alarming in a way she chose not to examine too closely. She and Cecil ate supper together every evening. They talked in the beginning about practical things, about the state of the cattle market, about the well that was running low, about the letter from the Kansas land office that required a careful response. Then gradually, over weeks, the conversations deepened. Not dramatically, not in a way that either of them seemed to plan. It was more like water finding its natural course, wearing a channel through stone so slowly you did not notice until the channel was already there. He told her about the ranch, how he had come to Kansas from Missouri in 1864, fresh from a war he preferred not to discuss, with nothing but a horse and a deep need to be somewhere that the evidence of human cruelty was not on every road. He had built the first structure himself, a single-room soddy, and had lived in it for 2 years before it became something more. He had married Margaret in 1871 in Dodge City. They had built the ranch house together in 1873, carrying the lumber from town themselves because they could not afford to pay someone else to do it. She chose the windows, Cecil said one evening. It came out of nowhere, unprompted, while Helen was pouring coffee. Insisted on real glass. I thought it was a luxury we could not afford. She said she was not going to spend the rest of her life looking at the world through oilcloth. Helen set the coffee pot down. She was right, she said. Cecil looked up at her. The lamplight was on his face and his expression was the most open she had ever seen it, which still was not very open but was enough. Yes, he said, she was. They looked at each other across the table, and something honest and fragile passed between them, and then Cecil cleared his throat and picked up his coffee, and the moment closed over itself like water closing over a stone. But Helen held it in her chest like an ember. She had been there just over a month when she found the bottle. Not the first bottle, she was not naive. She had smelled whiskey on him before, but this was different. This was a bottle hidden in the barn behind a loose board, half empty at noon on a Tuesday, and when she stood there with it in her hands, she understood that Darnell's worried eyes and Cecil's increasingly remote evening silences had been pointing at something she had been trying not to see. She did not confront him immediately. She thought about it, turned it over in her mind the way she turned over a problem in figures, looked at it from every angle. She put the bottle back where she found it. She had been taught by her father, the school teacher, that the most dangerous kind of hidden motive is the one a person hides from themselves. Cecil Hadley was not drinking to forget Margaret. He was drinking because he believed he did not deserve to move on from her, and that was an entirely different and more dangerous kind of grief. She went through his desk one afternoon when he was out, not recklessly but deliberately, because she needed to understand the full shape of the situation before she could think about how to address it. She found the letters from his sons. There were several from Everett, written from Wichita, where the young man had apparently taken a position with a freight company. There were fewer from Thomas, written from a ranch further north in the state, terse and brief, and clearly the letters of a young man who had learned his economy of expression from his father. And then there were 2 letters that Cecil had written and not sent, one to each of them, and Helen read them both, and they broke her heart. They were not cruel letters. They were the letters of a man who loved his children completely and had decided, for reasons he had clearly examined and found logical, and that were in fact nothing more than self-destruction dressed as selflessness, that his presence in their lives was more of a burden than a gift. He told Thomas that the ranch would go to him when he died, though he did not expect Thomas to want it. He told Everett that the money in the Dodge City Bank was in both their names and Everett should take his half now rather than waiting. He spoke of himself in both letters in the past tense, and when Helen finished reading, she sat very still for a long time with the letters in her hands. He was not planning to harm himself in any direct way. She did not believe that. But he had decided to stop living, and that was a different kind of harm, but it arrived at the same place eventually. She wrote to both sons that evening, using the address from their own letters, and she was careful and honest, and she told them what she had observed in 6 weeks on their father's ranch. She told them that she did not presume to understand their relationship with him or the full history of their estrangement. She told them that she had found 2 unsent letters and that their father had written them off and that she thought they deserved to know. She told them she was not trying to interfere in a family she was not part of, but that she also could not in good conscience keep silent. She mailed both letters on the same day she found the second bottle. She had not told Cecil any of this. That was the secret that his sons arrived with their anger to confront her about. And standing in the dusty yard with both of them glaring at her, she held her ground and she did not apologize. "I would make the same choice again," she said. "If you are angry, you are welcome to be angry. But your father is not well and he is alone, and the 2 of you are the only people in the world who can reach him in the particular place where he is broken." There was a long silence. The wind moved over the dry grass. Thomas said slowly, "He is going to be furious." "Yes," Helen said, "he will be." Everett looked at his brother. Something passed between them, the first cooperative look she had seen from them, uncertain and weighted with a shared history she was not part of. Then Everett looked at her. "You said he rode out south," he said. "Yes," Helen said, "south pasture. He went about 2 hours ago." Thomas and Everett looked at each other one more time. Then, without a word between them, they both turned and walked toward the barn. They both ran. Not literally, not yet, but they moved with the same urgency, the same direction, the same purpose. And for the first time in however many years of silence and separate lives, they were moving together. Helen stood in the yard and watched them go, and her heart was doing something complicated that had nothing to do with their departure. It had everything to do with the man riding slowly through the south pasture, alone, carrying a grief that had almost consumed him whole. She went inside and put water on the stove for coffee and waited. What happened in the south pasture took approximately 2 hours, and Helen was not there for it and never fully learned all the details. Cecil came back first, riding in at a walk, his face closed down to its most unreadable expression. He dismounted without looking at Helen and was heading for the house when he stopped on the porch and stood very still. She was in the doorway. She had the coffee ready. "You wrote to them," he said. It was not a question. "Yes," Helen said. He stood on the porch with his hat in his hand and the evening light coming sideways across his face, and he looked at her for a very long time. His expression moved through several things she could name and several she could not. The thing that frightened her most was the moment when it moved through something that looked like gratitude before it settled back into carefully maintained distance. "That was not your decision to make," he said. "No," Helen agreed. "It was not, but you had made yours and I thought it was a worse one." His jaw tightened. "You read my letters." "Yes." He was quiet for so long that the light shifted noticeably. Then he said very quietly, "Those were private." "I know," Helen said. She did not try to justify it further because she thought he deserved the full weight of what she had done, and she thought she deserved whatever consequence came from it. The consequence was 3 days of near silence. Cecil was polite. He ate his meals and said a few necessary words and was never unkind. But the careful warmth that had been building between them over 6 weeks was gone, replaced by a formal distance that felt like standing in a room that had recently been on fire. You could tell it had been warm. You could feel the emptiness where the warmth had been. Thomas and Everett stayed in the bunkhouse. Cecil had not thrown them off the property, which Helen took as a meaningful sign. He also did not speak to them at meals, but he sat at the same table, and Helen noticed that when Thomas passed the salt without being asked, Cecil took it without comment, and that was also meaningful. What changed everything was the horse. One of Cecil's breeding mares, a roan named Clara, had been struggling with her first pregnancy for 2 days. Darnell had been watching her carefully, but on the fourth morning he came to the house in the early gray light and knocked urgently, and when Helen opened the door he was pale and urgent. "It is bad," he said. "The foal is turned wrong." Helen was not a ranch woman by birth, but she had spent 6 weeks learning everything she could about how this place worked, and she had read the veterinary pamphlet in Cecil's desk 3 times, and she put on her work boots and followed Darnell to the barn without stopping to wake Cecil. She did not want to wake Cecil. She wanted to handle it. She was knee-deep in straw and focused entirely on the problem when Cecil came in 20 minutes later, alerted by some instinct or by a sound she had not heard, and he stopped in the barn doorway and took in the scene. Darnell was holding the mare's head. Helen was entirely calm and focused, and was doing what needed to be done with her sleeves rolled to the elbows. "Get Thomas," Cecil said to no one in particular, and then he was moving across the barn. Thomas arrived before Cecil reached Helen, and without any conversation between them, without direction, the 3 of them worked together in the specific way that people work together in an emergency, moving around each other and filling the spaces that needed filling. Everett arrived shortly after and took over holding the mare's head so Darnell could assist more directly. The foal came alive after another 20 minutes. A bay colt, small and determined, who stood within the hour on trembling legs while his mother cleaned him with patient attentiveness. Everyone stood and watched him in the quiet of the barn. The sky outside was turning pale gold with early morning. Cecil said roughly to no one in particular, "Good work." It was not much, but it was the first thing he had said that was not entirely functional in 4 days, and Helen heard Thomas exhale beside her, a slow, careful breath, and she understood that the word good had not been directed at the work alone. The ice did not break all at once. It broke the way ice always breaks, slowly at first and then all at once, piece by piece and then suddenly. That evening at supper, Thomas mentioned a problem he had been having with a fence line on his own property, and Cecil, without lifting his eyes from his plate, said, "That is a drainage issue," and proceeded to explain what needed to be done, and Thomas listened, and for a while they sounded like a father and son who had always talked this way. Everett watched them with an expression that Helen recognized as someone trying very hard not to show that they were moved. After supper, Helen was washing dishes and Everett appeared in the kitchen doorway and said, "Can I help?" Helen looked at him. He was 24 and he had his father's jaw but his mother's lighter coloring, and he looked at that moment like a young man who had been carrying a heavy thing for a long time and was not sure it was safe to put it down. "You can dry," Helen said. He dried. They worked in companionable silence for a while, and then Everett said without looking at her, "He almost died last winter. Did you know that?" Helen's hands stilled in the water. "No," she said. "Fever," Everett said. "Darnell wrote to me. I came, but I did not come inside. I stood at the gate and then I turned around. He was quiet. I have been angry at him for a long time, for not coming home when our mother was dying. For everything that came after. Thomas is angry too, we just handle it differently." Helen started washing again slowly. "He has been angry at himself for the same thing," she said. "Longer than you have been angry at him." Everett set down a plate carefully. "I know," he said. "I think that is part of what made me so angry, because if he could forgive himself then I would have to as well, and I did not want to." Helen looked at him. "That is a very honest thing to say." Everett almost smiled. He had the same quality as his father, that almost smile that held back something larger. "You are very difficult to deceive," he said. "I imagine my father finds that alarming." Helen looked back at the dishes. "I imagine he does," she said. The weeks that followed had a different quality. Thomas stayed at the ranch for 10 days before he needed to go back to his own property. Everett stayed for 2 weeks. During that time something began to be repaired, slowly and imperfectly and sometimes painfully, between a father and his sons. They argued about the cattle, about fencing, about the best way to manage a dry summer. They did not argue directly about the things that mattered most, about Margaret, about the distances of recent years. But those things were present in every argument. The way a river is present underground even when you cannot see it, shaping the surface from below. Helen stayed out of it as much as she could. She cooked and managed and was quietly useful, and she tried very hard not to let her own feelings about Cecil Hadley become obvious, which was increasingly difficult because her feelings about Cecil Hadley were becoming less quiet and more insistent with every passing week. It had crept up on her the way the important things in life tended to creep up. She would turn from the kitchen window and find him standing in the yard talking to Darnell, his hands moving slightly as he described something, his posture easy and present in a way it had not been in the early weeks, and something would move in her chest that she could not pass off as general well-being. She would be reading in the evening and look up and find his eyes on her with that quality of focused attention, and she would look back, and the pause before he looked away would lengthen almost imperceptibly week by week. He had started talking to her again, fully, the formal distance gone, more than before. He talked to her the way she suspected he had once talked to Margaret, with the assumption that what he said would be understood and responded to honestly. He asked her opinion on things, about the cattle prices, about a disagreement with a neighboring rancher named Holt over water rights, about a letter from a land agent in Wichita that seemed too convenient to be trustworthy. "I think it is a trap," Helen said about the land agent's letter, laying it flat on the table and pointing to specific sentences. "Look at this clause here. He is trying to secure a first right of purchase on your east pasture without committing to any actual price. If he gets you to sign this, he can come back in a year and offer you half of what it is worth, and you will have already agreed that he has the right of first refusal." Cecil read the clause again. Then he looked at her. "You read that fast," he said. "My father taught me to read contracts as carefully as scripture," Helen said. "He said they were both documents people agreed to without understanding." Cecil set the letter down. "I would not have caught that," he said. Something in his voice shifted, something she had not heard before, a warmth without the careful management he usually applied to his warmth, something more direct than his usual indirection. "You would have caught it eventually," Helen said. "I just got there first." "Yes," he said, and then quietly, "I am glad you are here." The sentence landed differently than his previous expressions of appreciation had landed. She could feel the difference. She looked at him steadily and said, "I am glad to be here." They sat with that for a moment, the room very quiet, the evening outside going deep blue behind the clean glass windows that Margaret had chosen and Helen had now polished to clarity. Then Cecil stood up and said he needed to check on Clara's colt, and left, and Helen sat at the table for a long time after, holding the feeling in both hands. Thomas came back the following week. He had sold his northern property, a piece of news that arrived first in a letter and then in person, and he came with his belongings in a wagon and a statement delivered at supper with characteristic Hadley economy of expression. "I'm going to work this ranch with you if you will have me." Cecil looked at his older son for a long moment. Then he said, "The east room needs a new window frame." Thomas said, "I noticed." And that was that. Helen watched the two of them from across the table and thought that she had never seen grief actually begin to lift before, not in real life, and that it looked nothing like she would have expected. It did not look like sunshine breaking through clouds. It looked like two men refusing to look directly at each other while passing the cornbread, and doing it on purpose, in the same room together, which was progress that felt like a river slowly finding its course. Everett came back 3 weeks after Thomas, having given his notice with the freight company in Wichita, and he brought with him a practical knowledge of ledgers and accounts that turned out to be exactly what the ranch needed. Cecil looked at the accounts Everett reorganized and then looked at his younger son with an expression that Helen recognized now, the one that meant he was feeling something large that he did not know how to say, and Everett recognized it too because he looked away first. "There is a discrepancy in the cattle count from last fall," Everett said, professional and steady. "I think Holt's men have been grazing their cattle on your south pasture and counting them in your tallies." Cecil's expression sharpened. "You are sure?" "Near enough," Everett said. I need another 2 days with the records, Cecil nodded. He looked at his two sons, Thomas by the window and Everett at the desk, and Helen, watching from the kitchen doorway, saw something move through his face that she could only describe as a man catching sight of something he had given up expecting. He caught her watching him and she did not look away. His expression stayed open for 1 full second before the management came back, but in that 1 second she saw it clearly. He was not just healing. He was beginning, in some frightened and tentative and very real way, to hope. The confrontation with Holt happened on a Thursday in September. Holt was a man of 50 who had come to Comanche County with money, and had not been improved by the experience of having it. And the water rights dispute had been simmering for the better part of a year before Everett's discovery about the cattle counts gave it a sharper edge. Cecil rode over to the Holt property with Thomas and Everett, and Helen did not go with them because it was not her place, but she stood on the porch and watched them ride out together, 3 of them on horses, moving in the same direction. And she thought that 3 months ago none of this would have been possible, and she was not entirely sure any of it would have been possible without her letters, and without the confrontation in the yard, and without all the small daily acts of paying attention that had preceded both of those things. She was not proud of herself in an uncomplicated way. She was aware that she had overstepped and that overstepping had been necessary, and that both things could be true. She was aware that her motives had not been entirely selfless, that some part of her, the part she examined least comfortably in the early morning hours, had needed Cecil Hadley to have reasons to live because she could not bear the thought of a world where he did not. That was not a small thing to admit to herself. She went inside and made bread. They came back in the late afternoon, all 3 of them, and Holt would not be grazing his cattle on Hadley land anymore, and the water rights dispute had a written resolution in Cecil's coat pocket. Thomas looked satisfied. Everett looked like he had enjoyed it more than was perhaps strictly appropriate. Cecil looked like himself, steady and quiet, but there was something different in the way he dismounted, a kind of ease in his body that had not been there before, a person who had handled a real problem with his sons beside him and had remembered what that felt like. He handed Darnell his horse and turned toward the house, and Helen was in the doorway and he stopped. "It is resolved," he said. "I am glad," Helen said. He came up the porch steps and stopped very close to her and said, quietly enough that only she could hear, "I do not know how to say what I need to say." Helen looked up at him. His face was very close and very serious, and this close she could see the fine lines at the corners of his eyes, and the gray that had moved further into his dark hair over the summer, and the thing in his expression that was no longer grief or distance, but something much more present and much more frightening. "You can take your time," she said, and her voice was not entirely steady. "I have been taking my time," he said. "I have been taking so much time that I am concerned you will leave before I manage it." Helen's heart was doing something very loud inside her chest. "I have not given you any indication that I am leaving," she said. "No," he said, "you have not." He was quiet for a moment. Behind them, Thomas and Everett were unsaddling their horses and talking, and Darnell was hauling water, and the ordinary life of the ranch was continuing, and Cecil Hadley was standing very still looking at Helen Slater, as if she was the center of something he had finally allowed himself to navigate toward. "When you came here," he said slowly, "I had decided that this was the end of something. I want you to know that you changed that, and I want you to know that I am aware that it was not your responsibility to do it." Helen said, "I did not do it for a sense of responsibility." Something moved in his face. "No," he said, "I did it because she stopped." The honest word was available and she held it for a moment and then she let it out. "Because I did not want you to disappear, because you are someone worth keeping in the world. Because somewhere in the first 3 weeks I stopped thinking of this as an arrangement and started thinking of it," as she paused again, not from reluctance but from the need to be accurate, "as something I did not want to leave." Cecil was very still. His hat was in his hand. The evening light was on his face. "Helen," he said. just her name in his careful voice, and it held approximately everything. "Yes," she said. He reached out and touched her face. Just his fingertips against her cheek, very briefly, the way a man touches something he is finally allowing himself to believe is real. Then he said, "I would like to ask you properly. When I have managed to find the words, I want it to be done properly." Helen breathed out slowly. "I will wait," she said. He smiled. A full, real, unhurried smile, the first one she had seen, and it transformed his face so completely and so honestly that she had to look away for a moment, because it was almost too much to hold. "Do not wait too long," she added, and he laughed, also for the first time, a real and sudden laugh, and she heard Thomas stop mid-sentence behind them and presumably stare, because she suspected his father had not laughed in a very long time. He asked her properly a week later. He was not a man for speeches or elaborate gestures. He asked her in the way he did most things, straightforwardly and after careful thought, standing in the kitchen in the evening while she was putting away the dishes. And what he said was not long, but it was precise and complete, and it was the truest proposal she had ever imagined being offered. He told her that he was not an easy man to be with, that he knew it, that he was working on it with uneven success. He told her that he had loved his first wife very much, and that he was not trying to replace her, and that he did not think love worked that way, that a person's capacity for it did not diminish with use. He told her that in the months she had been on his ranch, she had made it into a home again in a way he had not thought possible, and that she had given him back his sons by sheer force of honesty, and that he had watched her handle every hard thing with an intelligence and a steadiness that he admired more than he had words for. He told her that he thought he was falling in love with her, and that this was alarming to him, but that he had decided to be alarmed and proceed rather than retreat again. And then he said, "Helen Slater, I would like you to be my wife if you are willing, and I want you to know that willing is what I need it to be. Not obligated, not settled for. Willing." Helen set down the dish she was holding very carefully. "I am willing," she said. "I am more than willing. I have been willing since approximately week 3 when you told me that quiet was a luxury and looked at me sideways, and I thought that you were someone I wanted to know for a very long time." Cecil looked at her steadily and then crossed the kitchen in 2 steps and kissed her, careful and then not careful, thorough and honest and entirely unlike a man who had been uncertain. And when he stepped back, he was holding both her hands and his eyes were warm in a way that she was going to spend the rest of her life wanting to protect. Thomas and Everett found out at breakfast the next morning. Thomas looked at his plate. Then he said, "That was obvious," in a tone that suggested it had been obvious for weeks and he had been waiting impatiently. Everett smiled, the wide sudden smile that was his own and nothing like his father's, and said, "Welcome to the family, Helen." And Helen looked at the 3 Hadley men at the breakfast table and felt something large and real and very warm settle into the center of her chest. They were married in Dodge City in October of 1882 by a judge named Calloway who had known Cecil since the early years and seemed genuinely pleased. Darnell stood up with them. Thomas and Everett sat in the 2 chairs that constituted the audience. The ceremony was brief, and the weather outside was the clear, cool gold of a Kansas October, and Helen wore her blue dress, the best one she had brought from St. Louis, and Cecil wore his good coat and looked at her the way he had been practicing looking at her all these weeks, with that full attention that made her feel both seen and safe. When the judge said, "You may kiss your bride," and Cecil did, Thomas made a sound that was almost certainly an attempt to suppress a laugh, and Everett did not attempt to suppress anything and simply laughed freely. The winter of 1882 into 1883 was cold and full. The ranch house that had been too quiet for too long became the kind of place where fires burned in the evenings and voices overlapped, and Darnell ate supper at the family table, because Helen had made it clear within a week of her marriage that she would not have him eating alone in the bunkhouse when the bunkhouse was 20 degrees colder than the house. Cecil had observed this development with a raised eyebrow, and then had gone to fetch another chair without comment, which was his way of being entirely in agreement. Helen and Cecil learned each other with the care and attention that two intelligent people bring to something they have decided is worth understanding fully. He was patient and steady and occasionally distant in ways she had learned to navigate, the way you navigate a river whose currents you have studied, knowing where the deep, quiet places were and what they meant. She was direct and clear-eyed and occasionally too quick to act, as they had both established early on, and he was patient with that too, and she was working on it. They had disagreements. Not many and not vicious, but real ones. The most significant was about the Holt situation, which had a second chapter in the spring when Holt attempted to buy the goodwill of the county commissioner and get the water rights agreement renegotiated. Helen's position was that they should take it immediately to the circuit court. Cecil's position was that legal proceedings were slow and expensive and that there was a more direct solution available. His direct solution involved a conversation that Helen felt carried more threat than was strictly necessary, and she said so in the specific and unambiguous way she had, and Cecil listened and then said, "You are not wrong about the threat. I was not going to follow through on it." "That is worse," Helen said. "You cannot negotiate from a position you are not willing to defend." Cecil looked at her. Then he said, "You are right about that too." They took it to the circuit court. They won. The spring brought other things. Helen's kitchen garden expanded into a proper kitchen garden, and then into an ambitious one, and by April she had a row of green beans and tomatoes, and a determined stand of sunflowers that Darnell maintained were impractical, and that everyone admitted were beautiful. Thomas had taken over the east section of the ranch with quiet efficiency, and was improving the cattle breeding program in ways that were visibly impressive by summer. Everett had the ranch's finances in a state of clarity they had apparently not seen for years, and had also, somewhat to everyone's surprise, begun a correspondence with a young woman in Dodge City named Priscilla Morrow, who was 21 and was the daughter of the man who kept the general store. Cecil looked at the letter on the kitchen table one morning and then at Helen and said, "He is more like me than I would have chosen for him." Helen smiled. "He is exactly like you," she said. "He fell in love with a woman he was not expecting and he does not know what to do about it." "What should he do?" Cecil said. "The same thing you did," Helen said. "Write her back." Helen found out she was expecting in June of 1883. She had suspected it for 2 weeks and had been characteristically direct with herself about both the evidence and the implications, and when she was certain, she waited for a quiet evening and then told Cecil the way she told him most important things, plainly and directly, and watching his face carefully for his response. He went very still. Then he reached across the table and took her hand in both of his and held it, and said nothing for a long time, and when he finally looked up his eyes were full in a way that she had only seen once before, on the night he had first touched her face on the porch. "Are you well?" he asked. It was a practical question, but it was also the largest possible question. "I am very well," Helen said. "I feel better than I have in years." He pressed her hand between his palms for a long moment. Then he said, "Margaret lost too before Thomas." His voice was careful and contained. "I want you to know that whatever comes, I am here." "I know," Helen said. "That is why I am not frightened." She was not entirely not frightened. She was a practical woman, and she knew enough about frontier medicine and about the realities of childbirth in 1883 Kansas to have a clear-eyed understanding of the risks. But she was also a woman who had come to Kansas from St. Louis with nothing but her own capability and had built something real and solid and warm, and she was not inclined to surrender to fear when the alternative was hope. Thomas and Everett reacted to the news with characteristic difference. Thomas said, "Good," which in Thomas language was approximately equivalent to a speech. Everett said he was going to be a spectacular uncle and immediately wrote to Priscilla about it, which suggested his correspondence with her had progressed to a level of intimacy that Cecil raised an eyebrow at when he found out. "Should I have a conversation with her father?" Cecil asked Helen that evening. "Give it another month," Helen said. "Let Everett find his way there himself." Everett found his way there in 2 months. He came home from a trip to Dodge City in late August with the expression of a man who has done something large and slightly terrifying, and is extremely pleased about it. He sat down at the supper table and announced that he had asked Priscilla Morrow to marry him, and she had said yes, and her father had said yes, and he would like, if his father was willing, to bring her to the ranch to meet everyone before the wedding. Cecil said, "Of course," in the same tone he used for most practical matters, and then waited until Everett had gone out to tell Darnell the news before he looked at Helen and allowed the complicated softness in his expression to be visible for a moment. "He is happy," Cecil said. "Yes," Helen said, "he is." Cecil looked at the table. Then he said, "I spent 3 years trying to protect them from being connected to me. I thought I was doing it for them." Helen reached across and touched his hand. "You know that now," she said. "That is the thing that matters." Priscilla Morrow came to the ranch in September, a small, bright-eyed young woman with a quick intelligence and a straightforward warmth that Helen liked immediately. Priscilla was 21 and had been born in Kansas, and had a directness about the West that was different from Helen's learned directness, more native, less effortful. She looked at Everett with the kind of clear and decided affection that Helen recognized, the kind that has already done its weighing and arrived at a conclusion. The two women found each other across the supper table that first evening with the ease of people who are going to be friends for a long time. They talked about the ranch accounts, and the garden's coming winter dormancy, and the general character of Comanche County winters, and by the end of the meal, Helen had already mentally rearranged the sleeping arrangements to give them a guest room that was decent. Everett watched his future wife and his stepmother talk and looked like a man who has won something considerably larger than he expected. "She approves," Everett told Helen quietly in the kitchen afterward. "I know," Helen said. "I could tell. She told me your handwriting is terrible," Everett laughed. "She says I write like a man trying to outrun his own thoughts." "She is not wrong," Helen said. Everett leaned in the doorway and looked at her with something that was genuine and direct. "You know," he said, "when I got your letter back in July and I was so angry I thought you were overstepping. I thought you had no right." "I did not have the right," Helen said. "No," Everett said, "but you had something better. You had the correct judgment about what was needed." He paused. "I am glad you are not the kind of person who waited for the right." Helen looked at him. He had grown, she thought, in the months she had known him, from a young man carrying old anger to a young man who had put the anger down and picked up something considerably lighter and more useful. She was proud of him in a way that surprised her, a warm and genuine pride that was not presumptuous, not parental, but something adjacent to both. "I am glad you are not the kind of person who could not be reached," she said. He nodded. Then he went to find Priscilla and Helen went to find Cecil, who was on the porch in the cool evening, sitting in the chair he favored, looking out at the flat dark land and the enormous sky. She sat beside him. He put his arm around her without looking away from the sky, steady and easy, and she leaned into him and they sat together in the quiet that she had learned, months ago, was not absence but presence. "Are you well?" he asked, as he had been asking regularly, and she knew he meant the pregnancy and also meant everything else. "Yes," she said, "I am very well." He pressed a kiss to her temple. She felt him breathe in slowly and breathe out, and in the exhale she heard the last of something release that had been held for a long time. The boy arrived in March of 1884, on a cold, clear night that had one star bigger than all the others in the Kansas sky, which Darnell pointed out the following morning with an air of significance. Cecil was there for all of it in the house, closer than was conventional, because the doctor from Dodge City had come and was competent, but Cecil had sat outside the bedroom door for 3 hours and Helen had heard him, and called out twice to say she was all right and heard him go briefly quiet both times, reassured. When the doctor opened the door and said the word healthy, Helen heard a sound from Cecil that she had not heard before, a short and utterly unguarded sound that was relief in its most honest form. He came into the room and stood at the edge of the bed and looked at his wife and his son, and Helen watched his face and thought that she had never in her life seen anyone look the way he looked in that moment, like a man who has been handed something he had given up believing he deserved. They named the boy James. James Cecil Hadley, which pleased Cecil in a way he did not comment on but which was visible in the way he said the name the first time, quietly, as if he was learning a word in a new and entirely welcome language. Everett and Priscilla were married in Dodge City in April of 1884, a cheerful and well-attended ceremony that was followed by a supper at the Dodge City Hotel that Everett had organized with the kind of attention to logistics he brought to everything, and during which Thomas said more consecutive sentences than Helen had ever heard him say, apparently animated by the combination of good food and genuine happiness. Priscilla moved to the ranch with Everett, and she and Helen settled into a comfortable rhythm that made the household more lively than it had ever been in Helen's time there. Priscilla was practical and good-humored, and occasionally told Helen things about what Everett had written in his early letters that made Helen laugh until she had to hold her side. James grew quickly and loudly, and with a demanding cheerfulness that Cecil found, clearly and visibly, extraordinary. He was not a man who had ever been easy with small children, which he admitted to Helen directly and without too much self-reproach. With James he was careful and attentive in the way he was careful and attentive with anything he was committed to understanding, and James rewarded this by learning to recognize his father very early, and then by learning to follow him around the ranch with a purposeful toddle that everyone found deeply entertaining. Thomas observed his nephew with the expression of a man who is recalibrating certain opinions. He was, of all of them, the least demonstrative with James, but he was the one who showed up most reliably when James was fussy on the nights that Helen needed sleep, appearing in the kitchen with the quiet efficiency he brought to all practical problems, and managing the small boy with a competence that suggested he had thought about it more than he had indicated. "You will be good with children," Helen told Thomas one morning, because she thought he needed to hear it. Thomas looked up from the accounts he was going over. He considered this in the measured way he considered everything, and then he said, "I intend to find out." Helen raised her eyebrows. Thomas had not, to her knowledge, shown interest in anyone, despite being 27 and approximately the most capable man in the county. "Is there something you would like to tell me?" she asked. Thomas said, "Not yet," with the precision of a man who means soon but does not want to be pushed, and Helen respected that and did not push him. Soon turned out to be June, when Thomas came home from a cattle-buying trip to Meade County with a particular quality of contained alertness that Helen recognized, because she had seen it in Cecil in the weeks before he had found the words to propose to her. She said nothing and watched, and within 2 weeks Thomas had made a trip alone to Meade County and come back with the information that there was a schoolteacher there named Eleanor Graves who was 25 and had been born in Virginia, and had come west with her brother's family, and had opinions about cattle breeding that were, Thomas said, surprisingly well informed. Cecil listened to this account at supper with the most carefully neutral expression Helen had ever seen on his face, which meant he was suppressing something substantial. "She sounds interesting," Helen said encouragingly. Thomas said, "She is." Cecil said very carefully, "How often will you need to go to Meade County on business?" Thomas looked at his father. Something between them, the awareness of a parallel, the recognition of the same river running in 2 generations, was briefly visible, and then they both looked away, and the moment became ordinary. Helen looked at the table and smiled and said nothing. The summer of 1884 was hot and productive and full of life. James learned to walk in July, which was celebrated as if it were a civic event. Everett found a significant improvement in the cattle sales numbers by identifying a new buyer in Abilene that cut out 2 layers of middlemen. Cecil and Thomas together negotiated a grazing agreement with the adjacent land that was fair to all parties, and put the southern pasture to use in a way that increased the herd's viability considerably. The dark chapter of 3 years prior, the loneliness and the bottles hidden behind boards and the unsent letters, seemed very far away. Not forgotten, not pretended away, but transformed by everything that had followed into something more like a scar than a wound, permanent but no longer bleeding. Helen thought about this one evening when she and Cecil were sitting in the kitchen late, after James was asleep and the house was quiet. The way the house was quiet now, which was differently quiet from before, full of the remnants of the day rather than the absence of life. "What are you thinking about?" Cecil asked her. He could tell, he always could, when her mind was working on something rather than simply resting. "I am thinking about the difference between two kinds of quiet," she said. He considered this. "The empty kind and the full kind," he said. "Yes," Helen said. "This is the full kind." Cecil looked at her steadily. He had been doing this, the open-looking, the unheld attention, for nearly 2 years now, and she still felt it the same way she had felt it the first time he looked at her on the road in Dodge City, like being seen by someone who found what they saw worth looking at. "I spent 3 years in the empty kind," he said. "I did not know the difference until you were here." Helen reached across and took his hand. "You would have found your way back," she said. "You had Thomas and Everett." "Perhaps," Cecil said. "But not in the way that I found it." He paused. He was still working on saying the large things directly. It was still effortful, but he worked at it with the same diligence he brought to everything he valued. "What you gave me, what you give me, is not something they could have given. It is something different. It is the thing that makes the rest of it possible to carry. Do you understand what I mean?" Helen looked at him. The lamplight was on his face, and his hair was more silver now than dark, and his eyes held everything she had come to love, the depth and the steadiness and the warmth he kept like a fire banked against the cold, ready to be larger when you came close enough to feel it. "Yes," she said. "I understand exactly what you mean, because I feel it too." He lifted her hand and pressed his mouth to it, eyes closed, and held it there for a moment. Then he looked up and said, "Come to bed," and it was the simplest and most complete invitation she had ever been given. In the fall, Thomas made another trip to Meade County, and another, and then in October he brought Eleanor Graves to the ranch for a Sunday dinner. She was a compact, clear-eyed young woman with the particularly observant quality of a person who has spent years in a classroom watching people learn things, and has learned a great deal herself in the process. She assessed the Hadley household with a calm thoroughness that Helen recognized, because she had done the same thing on her own first visit, walking through rooms and cataloging what they said about the people inside them. At dinner, Eleanor sat across from Thomas and spoke directly to him about cattle, and about the Kansas school situation, and about a book she had been reading, and Thomas was more animated in response than Helen had seen him in all the time she had known him. It was like watching a window in a house you had thought was empty suddenly light up from inside. Cecil watched his older son talk to this woman, and his expression was warm and slightly wondering in a way that moved Helen very much. After dinner, when Eleanor and Helen were alone briefly in the kitchen while the men debated a fencing question outside, Eleanor looked at Helen and said without preamble, "He is a good man." "He is," Helen said. "He talks about his father and his brother in a way that tells me the family is whole now," Eleanor said. "It was not always." "No," Helen said. "It was not." Eleanor picked up a dish towel and began drying with the efficiency of a woman who cannot remain idle. "He told me about you," she said, "about how you wrote the letters." "He was angry about it once." "He was," Helen said. "He is not any more," Eleanor said. She glanced at Helen sideways, and in that sideways glance Helen saw someone who said things the way Helen said things, directly but with full awareness of what they cost. "He said you saw what was necessary and you did it even though it was not your right to do it. He said that is the kind of person the West needs more of and the kind he wants near him for a long time." Helen set down her dish. "He said all that," Eleanor smiled, the first full smile Helen had seen from her, and it was warm and unguarded. "He said quite a bit more than that. He talks more than you might expect when the subject is worth talking about." Helen laughed, a genuine and surprised laugh. "He gets that from his father," she said. "They are both oceans that look like ponds until you sail them." Alina considered this. Then she said, "I think I would like very much to sail that ocean." Thomas and Alina were married the following April, in the spring of 1885. The ceremony was held at the ranch itself, in the yard, which had been cleaned and decorated by Helen and Priscilla and Darnell, with the kind of thorough attention that made even the dry Kansas yard look celebratory. Alina wore a cream dress and carried wildflowers that she had gathered herself that morning, and Thomas looked at her as she walked toward him with an expression so thoroughly unlike his usual careful management of himself that Everett, standing beside him, quietly said something that made Thomas cut him a look of such eloquent warning that Everett immediately looked at the sky. Cecil stood beside Helen during the ceremony with his hand at the small of her back, and she could feel that he was moved in the contained way he was moved by all the important things, the warmth of it radiating through his palm. Afterward, when the celebration had wound down and the evening was coming in cool and golden, and Alina and Thomas were sitting on the porch steps talking quietly in the way people talk when they have just made a permanent decision together and are still marveling at it, Cecil found Helen in the kitchen and stood in the doorway and said, "Both of them." Helen looked at him. "Both of them," he said again, and in those two words she heard the whole of it, the years when they had been separate and distant, and the months when they had been cautiously reconnecting, and now this, both of them building full lives on the land where they had grown up and which they would eventually inherit, present and rooted and carrying something forward. "Yes," Helen said. Cecil came into the kitchen and stood close to her, and she leaned back against him and his arms came around her, and they stood like that while the sounds of the celebration drifted in from outside, James's high voice somewhere nearby, Darnell's laugh, Priscilla and Alina talking over each other, Thomas's single audible sentence that was clearly a counterargument to something. "Thank you," Cecil said quietly into her hair. Helen put her hands over his. "We built this together," she said. He pressed his mouth to the top of her head and held her in the warm kitchen while the last of the April light came through Margaret's windows. James was 1 year old and walking and talking in the determined babble of a child who has things to say and has not yet sorted out how to say all of them. He had Cecil's dark hair and Helen's direct gaze, and an independence of spirit that both of them recognized, and that Everett said was specifically alarming in someone 14 months old. In the summer of 1885, Priscilla told Everett they were expecting, which Everett received with such visible delight that he immediately went to find his father and Helen simultaneously, and arrived at their positions in the yard and the kitchen, respectively, within 30 seconds of each other by walking very fast in alternating directions, which James found fascinating enough to follow. The news traveled around the ranch and settled into it the way good news does, not explosively but warmly, becoming part of the fabric of the place. Cecil came to find Helen after supper, and they sat on the porch in the warm night, and he said, "Another one." "Another one," Helen agreed. "The ranch will be full of children," he said. He said it in the neutral tone he used when he was pleased by something and was not certain how much to show it. "It will," Helen said. "Is that alarming?" He considered. "No," he said. "The opposite of alarming." He paused. "It is what I thought this ranch would be when I was building it, before everything." Helen looked at him. The night around them was vast and warm and starred, and the sounds of the house behind them were full and various, and the man beside her was not the man she had seen on the Dodge City Road in June of 1882, or he was that man but changed, opened, restored to something he had almost permanently lost. "It is what it is now," she said. He turned and looked at her in the darkness, and she could see his face clearly enough, the steady dark eyes, the silver at his temples, the line of his mouth that she had memorized by now, the fullness of his attention, which was one of the things she loved most about him. "Yes," he said, "it is what it is now." He took her hand and they sat together on the porch in the big Kansas night, and the world around them was real and full and earned, and there was nothing between them that was unresolved. Everett and Priscilla's son arrived in February of 1886, a substantial and loud boy they named Samuel, who came into the world with an air of decided opinion that Everett said was entirely Priscilla's, and Priscilla said was Everett's, and Cecil said, looking at the infant with the particular expression of a man who has been through this enough to know what it means, was clearly Hadley. Helen stood in the doorway of Everett and Priscilla's room the morning after Samuel arrived and watched Cecil hold his grandson with the careful and wholehearted attention he brought to everything he loved, and she thought that this was what redemption actually looked like in real life. Not a single dramatic moment, but an accumulation of ordinary ones. A man learning to hold a small and demanding life with steadiness because he had been allowed. By love and by the passage of time and by the force of other people's refusal to give up on him, to believe that he was the right kind of person to be trusted with such things. She also thought, not for the first time, that she was expecting again. She told Cecil 3 weeks later, on a Sunday morning when the house was full of noise and the yard was bright with late winter sun, and James, who was almost 2, was engaged in a campaign to investigate everything within reach. Cecil stopped what he was doing, which was reading a letter from a cattle buyer in Abilene, and looked at her. "Again," he said. "Yes," Helen said. He set down the letter and stood up from the table and crossed the kitchen, and held her the way he held her when the feeling was larger than words, both arms around her and his face against her hair, and she felt his heart beating at the rate it beat when something had moved him entirely. "Are you well?" he asked. "I am always well," she said, and she could hear his almost laugh, the quiet sound that meant the smile was real, and she pulled back just far enough to see it. He was beautiful when he smiled. She had thought so from the first time she saw it, and she thought so now, and she would think so for every year they had together, and she planned on those years being many. "I am so thoroughly in love with you," Helen said. She said it because it was true, and because she believed in saying the true things directly, and because she never wanted him to wonder. Cecil looked at her for a moment with that whole open warmth, and then he said, "Helen, I do not have the words for what I am with you. I have been looking for them since October of 1882, and I have not found them yet." "You have time," she said. "I have time," he agreed, and kissed her in the morning kitchen while James investigated the flour bin, and the sun came through Margaret's windows onto the floor in long, bright patches. Their daughter arrived in September of 1886, small and dark-haired and unhurried, arriving in the world with a quiet alertness that the doctor said was unusual, and that Cecil said, with complete confidence, was perfectly natural. They named her Clara, after the roan mare, which was Thomas's suggestion delivered with characteristic efficiency and accepted by everyone with immediate recognition of its rightness. Clara grew up watching horses. From the time she could stand at the fence, she stood at the fence, and from the time she could walk, she walked toward them, and Cecil watched his daughter's single-minded interest in the animals with an expression that moved Helen every time she saw it. A surprised pride, a recognition of something that had not died after all but had simply been waiting to appear in a new shape. James was 2.5 and thoroughly delighted by his sister in the possessive and complex way that older siblings are delighted by younger ones. He was also, as far as anyone could tell, going to be tall and dark like his father and direct like his mother, which combination all 3 Hadley brothers agreed was going to be an interesting thing to witness. The winter of 1886 and into 1887 was the kind that Kansas produced with occasional vicious commitment, prolonged and cold and hard on the cattle. The ranch came through it with losses that were painful but not ruinous, partly because Everett's careful accounting had built a reserve for exactly this kind of year, and partly because Cecil and Thomas had made the early decision to move the most vulnerable animals to the near pasture before the first hard freeze. acting on a reading of the sky and the wind that came from 20 years of attention to this specific piece of land. Helen managed the household and the books during that winter with a thoroughness that kept them solvent and comfortable, and she managed herself, which meant she did not pretend that the cold and the confinement and the weight of anxiety were not present, but she also did not allow them to become larger than they needed to be. She had learned this from Cecil. She had also, she suspected, always had it. By spring, the losses had been calculated, and the recovery plan was in place, and the new calves were coming in encouraging numbers, and Helen stood at the kitchen window in April and watched the yard come back to life, the mud drying into usable ground, Darnell moving with his usual cheerful efficiency, Thomas and Alina's small figure visible on the east rise where Thomas was checking fence. Alina was expecting. She had told Helen in January with the calm directness that characterized her, and she and Thomas were treating the prospect with the combined practicality of two people who have thought carefully about what they are doing and find the prospect sound. Cecil came in for mid-morning coffee and stood beside Helen at the window and followed her gaze toward the east rise. "He is going to be a father," Cecil said. "Yes," Helen said. "I was not there," Cecil said very quietly. He did not need to say for what. "When they were small, I was there, but I was not present, not the way I should have been." Helen turned to look at him. This was something he had been coming at sideways for months, the reckoning with the years of his first parenthood when his own dark past had made him remote and unavailable in ways his sons had carried for a long time. "You were here when it mattered," she said. "You were here when they came back. You were here for the mare and the fence and the Holt situation and every supper since. You are here now." He looked at her. "That is generous." "It is accurate," she said. "Generous would be telling you it was fine. Accurate is telling you that what you did since is real and it counts and your sons know it counts." He was quiet for a moment. Outside in the yard, James was attempting to teach himself to rope a fence post, with mixed results, and Clara was watching him from the porch with the focused patience of someone who is studying a process. "She is going to be better at that than he is within a month," Cecil said, his voice shifting. Helen looked at her children and smiled. 3 weeks, she said. Thomas and Alina's son, Benjamin, arrived in July of 1887 and was given a reception by the entire ranch household that might have been disproportionate for a small infant, but was entirely proportionate for the event, which was the completion of something. 3 Hadley brothers, 2 wives, 2 children already on the ground and now Thomas's son, and Darnell raising a glass of water because he did not drink and saying, with the simple and genuine warmth that had always been his particular gift, "To the family." Cecil stood in the yard that evening with James on his hip, which James was nearly too old for, and which Cecil clearly did not care about, and Helen beside him, and the light going orange and vast across the Kansas sky, and he was the man she had seen on that road in Dodge City, and also someone entirely different, someone who had come through the dark chapter and arrived somewhere real and warm and permanently inhabited. He looked at her and said, "You once told me that quiet sounds like a luxury." "I did," Helen said. "You were right about that too," he said. "The full kind of quiet." Helen leaned her head against his shoulder. James patted his father's face with a small determined hand, apparently requiring attention. Cecil obliged without looking away from Helen. "I think we have built something rather extraordinary," Helen said. Cecil considered this with his characteristic thoroughness. Then he said, "Yes, I think we have." Darnell started a family of his own in 1888, marrying a woman named Rosie, who had come up from Texas with her brother and had stopped in Comanche County, because she liked the way the sky looked and had not yet found a reason to leave. When she met Darnell, she found one to stay. Cecil and Helen attended their wedding with as much genuine celebration as any event in their lives, because Darnell had been present and faithful through all of it, and was as much a part of what the ranch had become as anyone who shared the family name. Cecil told Darnell on the morning of his wedding, not at the ceremony but in the barn while they were saddling the horses to drive to town, that he was the best hand he had ever had, and that the East Quarter cottage was his for as long as he wanted it, and that the pay he had been receiving was insufficient and he was adjusting it. Darnell stood still for a moment and then said, "I know the pay was low. I stayed anyway." "I know," Cecil said. "I am aware of what that cost you and what it says about your character." Darnell looked at him. Two men in a barn in 1888 Kansas, both of whom understood perfectly well the weight of what had not been said about the world they were standing in and the injustice of how it was arranged, and neither of whom had the power to fix the arrangement entirely, but both of whom were choosing, in the space available to them, to treat each other with the full weight of honest regard. "Thank you, Mr. Hadley," Darnell said. "Cecil," Cecil said. He had said it before, he said it again. Darnell smiled, the broad, warm smile that could light a barn. "Thank you, Cecil." They drove to town and Darnell married Rosie, and the celebration afterward extended back to the ranch and lasted until the stars were very prominent, and James fell asleep standing up and had to be carried to bed by his father, who did it without comment. By 1889, the ranch had become what Cecil had once imagined it would be when he had carried lumber from Dodge City with a young woman who insisted on real glass in the windows. It was full and running well and inhabited by people who had chosen it or been born into it and who had decided, each in their own way, that it was worth their full commitment. Helen was 30 years old in 1889. She had lived in Kansas for 7 years, and she had grown into it the way something planted in unfamiliar soil grows into the shape of the new ground, recognizably itself, but formed by where it had been placed. She was not the St. Louis woman who had answered an advertisement with a mixture of capability and desperation. She was the woman who had built something, who had looked at a man in ruins and believed he was worth the trouble of honest intervention, who had walked into a house full of dust and grief, and had, by sheer application of presence and practical intelligence, turned it into somewhere worth living. She was also, in April of 1889, expecting their third child. Cecil received this news with a warmth and steadiness that had become the most reliable thing she knew in the world, and James and Clara received it with a difference that was entirely characteristic of them. James with loud enthusiasm about a brother, Clara with a measured interest that suggested she was making no assumptions about the outcome. The child, born in December of 1889, was a boy, which James received as personal vindication, and Clara received with the equanimity of someone who had expected it. They named him Walter, after Helen's father, which was Cecil's suggestion, delivered quietly one evening and received by Helen with a fullness of feeling that she did not immediately have words for. "Walter Cecil Hadley," she said. "If you like it," Cecil said. "I like it very much," Helen said. She looked at him steadily. This man she had married in a Dodge City courthouse 7 years ago on a cold October morning. This man who had been broken and had allowed himself to be put back together, who had given her 3 children and a full and real life in the enormous Kansas sky, who still looked at her with that focused attention that felt like the most complete kind of being seen. "I love you," she said, directly and simply, because she always said it directly when she felt it completely. Cecil looked at her with the warm and unhurried clarity that was, after 7 years, still the thing she held most carefully, and said, "Helen, I have been trying to find words adequate to what you are to me since 1882. I have not found them yet, but I want you to know that I am not looking for them because I doubt the feeling. I am looking for them because the feeling is so large that ordinary words keep not being enough." Helen held the infant Walter in her arms and looked at her husband and thought that this, exactly this, was the thing she had been trying to describe when she said full quiet, when she said building something extraordinary. This was a man who had been alone and lost and had been reached by letters and by stubbornness, and by the force of a love that had not asked permission before it arrived, and who had allowed himself to be saved and had saved her in return, though she had not known she needed saving until she found herself saved. Outside the bedroom door, she could hear James arguing with Everett about something, and Clara's small, clear voice, interjecting a correction, and Priscilla's laugh, and Thomas's single, audible sentence, and the ordinary warm noise of a house that was full of people who had chosen each other, imperfectly and repeatedly and permanently. Cecil came and sat on the edge of the bed and looked at his son and his wife in the lamplight, and he put his arm around Helen and she leaned into him, the infant between them, the house full of life around them, the Kansas night vast and starred outside Margaret's windows. "We are home," Helen said. Cecil pressed his mouth to her hair and held her and the baby and the warmth of everything they had made together, and said, his voice low and entirely certain, "We have been for a while now." And so they were. The Hadley Ranch in Comanche County, Kansas, in the winter of 1889, was not a place where grief kept silence, or where fathers wrote letters they did not send, or where sons drove past the gate and turned their horses around. It was a place where two men who had not done anything together in years had once ridden out to the south pasture with a shared purpose, and had ridden back with something repaired between them. It was a place where a woman from St. Louis had answered an advertisement and had found not only what she came for, but considerably more than she had known to look for. It was a place where the windows were clean, and the fires were banked against the cold, and the table at supper time was never large enough for everyone who gathered around it. It was a home that had been broken and had been made whole again, not by time alone but by choice, by the daily decision to stay and to see, and to speak the honest thing even when it overstepped, by love that had not waited for permission and had not been wrong to proceed without it. Helen Slater, now Helen Hadley, held her youngest son and leaned against her husband, and listened to the voices of the people they had gathered around themselves. And she thought that the school teacher in St. Louis had given her something true when he taught her to use the word capable, because capability was not the absence of fear or the absence of need, but the decision to act in the presence of both. She had acted. She had written letters and stood in a dusty yard and held her ground and loved a man with the full force of her honest self, and none of it had been certain, and all of it had been worth it. Cecil turned to look at her one more time before the lamplight faded into sleep, the way he had been turning to look at her for 7 years, the way she believed he would be turning to look at her for all the years that remained to them, and his dark eyes held everything, the history and the present and the deep, uncomplicated certainty of what they were to each other. Outside, the Kansas sky was full of stars, as it always was, as vast and indifferent and also as spectacular as it had always been, stretching over the flat earth and the clean windows and the warm house and all the people inside it. Inside, it was everything.